The fire raged. Its orange glow illuminated the dark form rising from its midst. The statue sat in the flames, reaching a height of 12 foot. Its dark bronze form began to shimmer as it heated up. The altar at its base already glowed bright red, ready to receive an offering. Figures in blue hooded robes emerged from the darkness behind the statue. They circled around both sides, chanting in an ancient language long forgotten by the rest of the world. A final figure in a red robe emerged. This one wore golden horns on its head. He stood in front of the statue, raised his hands, and shouted in the same language. The others swayed back and forth as they worshipped their god Moloch. Two others in red robes emerged and walked towards the one with the golden horns. A girl in a white dress walked between them. She had long dark hair and pale skin. The golden horned figure turned to face them. They stopped in front of him, and he pulled a long dagger from his robe. He used it to cut the dress from the girl's body. She stood before him nude. The blue-robed figure swaying and chanting around the statue took off their robes. Then the nude men and women continued to sway and chant. The firelight glowed on their naked bodies. Their chanting intensified, and the bronze statue glowed bright red, and steam rose from its nostrils. The golden horned man shouted a command. The two red-robed figures grabbed the girl by the arms. They turned her around and made her kneel in front of him. Her eyes were closed. The golden horned man placed a dagger at her throat and grabbed her by the hair. He said something in the ancient language and jerked the dagger across her throat. It cut deeply, releasing an arterial spray. Her eyes popped open. They were bright red. A voice spoke, "Find the Reaper." The preacher jerked awake. He let out a breath. The same dream again. He had this dream every night for over a month now. He couldn't get the girl's face out of his head, the surprise and anguish on her face as the dagger opened her throat. Those deep pools of red as her eyes opened. Who was she? What was God trying to tell him? Why did she have red eyes? If this dream was so important, why was he being led out of the dark wood? It took him months to figure out how to get here, and now he was being told to find this Reaper. He didn't doubt his purpose or wish to go his own way. He had done that his whole life, and it had brought him nothing but misery. He had left that life behind. Now his path was ordained by the Creator. He just wished that sometimes the path was a little clearer and less bloody. Packed up his bedroll and made a small fire for some tea. After a small breakfast of pemmican and green tea, he cleaned up his campsite and prepared to leave. Slipped on his pack and secured his sword. Despite his wish that it did not, its weight was always a comfort to him. Its ancient deadly steel a familiar weight against his side. He spent some time in prayer to ask for guidance before he started for the border of the dark wood. It wasn't far, but a person could spend their whole life living a foot from the border and never know it. There are many entrances into the dark wood, and they are all hidden. Even if you could pass through one by dumb luck, you will most likely never be able to pass back through. The dark wood wouldn't allow it. That is, of course, if the creatures that inhabit the forest didn't kill you first. He made his way to the border entrance. As he knew would happen, the trees tried to divert him from his path, shifting and bending their trail to steer him back into the dark wood or turn him around completely. He didn't know if he would ever get used to the idea of self-aware trees that moved at will. But he kept his compass in his hand and maintained the same heading no matter what stood in his way. This brought him to the entrance point, a clearing in the forest, scattered with large boulders. There were two large boulders at the far edge of the clearing, a larger one leaning against a smaller one, forming a narrow space between them. This space was the portal out of the dark wood and into the Uhari National Forest. If he were to walk around the boulders to the other side, there would be no opening, and he would just remain in the dark wood. He wasn't sure how it worked, other than to say it was a miracle. He moved towards the opening in the boulders and stopped when he heard a crack. He turned around but saw nothing but still forest. There was a slithering sound to his left. He drew his sword and turned. There was nothing. Suddenly something wrapped around his foot and yanked him to the ground. He was caught off guard as whatever had him by the ankle began to coil around his leg. He looked down. It was Bloodroot. He slashed at the root coiled around his leg. He severed it a couple inches above the ground. Blood-red sap spurted all over. He jumped up and kicked the root coil off his leg. He searched the ground as he heard crackling all around him now. 5 root coils shot out of the ground all at once, reaching for him. The preacher fell into practiced movements, swinging his blade and twisting his body, performing a deadly dance. 4 tentacles of the bloodroot fell to the ground. They withered and dried up as their red sap left them. The 5th tentacle was much larger than the others and lashed at him wildly. He swung his sword and it dodged the blow easily, swinging back around, striking him in the side and knocking him into the underbrush. The tentacle shot forward, grabbing his ankle and pulling him forward. Bloodroot was a strange creature, a carnivorous plant. It was a sit-and-wait predator, burying itself under the ground and sending its many tentacles out in all directions, waiting for unsuspecting prey to walk over it. Then it was just a matter of ensnaring it, squeezing the life out of it, and dragging it underground to be slowly digested. This bloodroot was not here when he came through the opening a few weeks ago. He slashed down with his sword, but the root twisted his whole body, and the blow was only glancing. The root coiled around his leg. He reached back for another blow, but his hand was caught as something wrapped around his wrist. He looked and was shocked. He said, "Oh, great, a puzzle vine." Puzzle vine was another carnivorous plant. It was a thorny bush that sent out strong vines to capture prey and drag them into its interior, shredding it against the unbelievably hard and sharp thorns that covered its branches. It's very curious how neither of these 2 creatures were here when he exited the opening, but they are here now. It's also curious how they never inhabit this part of the Darkwood. It's almost like they were put here to block his return. He tore at the vine holding his wrist with his free hand. Another vine lashed out and grabbed that hand. Both vines began to pull him towards the bush. The bloodroot continued to pull him towards its spot under the dirt. It coiled around both of his legs now. The preacher jerked and bucked, trying to free himself. It was useless. The plants continued to pull. Neither would stop. He had no idea which was stronger, but he was sure they could continue to pull until each got a half of them. He said, "Creator, help me." As if in answer, a voice said, "Looks like you could use some help." He looked in the brush to his side and was startled to see a tiger staring back at him. Its orange, intelligent eyes studied him. He knew of the enlightened creatures, but had little experience with them. The tiger said, "Well?" The preacher stammered, yes, please." The tiger regarded him a moment longer and said, "I would be happy to oblige, but I'll need something from you." The preacher didn't know how to react. He was negotiating for his life with a talking tiger. The vines and the roots that held him made the decision easy as they pulled him ever tighter. He wouldn't be able to talk before long. He said, "Absolutely. What do you need?" The tiger said, "I need for you to show me how to get out of this accursed forest." "Done. Now help me get my hands free." The tiger looked at the vines holding his hands. He stepped over and stood in front of them. Then he turned and looked down in the preacher's eyes. He said, "I need you to understand, if you lie to me or backtrack on our agreement, I will kill you myself." The preacher said, "Fair enough. I understand. Now please." The tiger lifted his front paw and swiped at the vines. His claws made short work of them, and the preacher fell to the ground and scooted forward as the bloodroot suddenly won the tug-of-war. The preacher sat up and hacked at the root with his sword. He wiggled out of the coils and stood watching as the bloodroot pulled its severed tentacles under the ground. It would stay there dormant while its tentacles regenerated. He walked over, and with a downward thrust and a twist, he killed the bloodroot. There was a loud popping and cracking. The ground vibrated for a moment, then stopped as the blood-red sap bubbled up where the preacher's sword pierced the ground. He pulled his sword out of the ground and wiped the blade clean before sheathing it. He turned to see the tiger sitting and watching him. He pulled his pack off and retrieved the tinder bundle, ferro rod, and a small bottle of lighter fluid. He fluffed the tinder into a bird's nest and walked closer to the puzzle vine bush. The bush shimmied as if a breeze were blowing. He squirted the bush with the lighter fluid, making sure to circle all around. Then he knelt, used his ferro rod to light the tinder bundle, and tossed it into the bush. With a whoosh, the bush went up in flames. It immediately started to shake violently. Its two severed vines shot out and lashed back and forth violently. The tiger had watched all this silently. He said, amusing, "Now, for your part of our bargain?" The preacher said, "Of course. I had to ensure these wouldn't be here if I returned this way. Seems they were placed here to ensnare me." The tiger said, "Indeed, although I didn't know it at the time." "What do you mean?" The tiger stood and stretched. "I came across one of the lumbering beasts of Nod walking through the forest carrying 2 large burlap sacks. I knew one of them wouldn't be this far from their masters without their leave, so I followed him." The preacher knew of the beast of Nod. They were the servants of the disciples of the goat, huge hairy beasts that many would call a Sasquatch, although that was not what they were. Wendigo would be a more accurate word. Here in the Darkwood, they were just called Beast of Nod or Nods. He said, "And the beast planted these creatures here?" "Yes, it was very curious. So I stayed around and waited. Then you came along just a day later." The preacher was a little shocked by the revelation. It meant not only did the disciples know of his presence here, they also knew where he entered the Darkwood. He would have to find a new entrance. He brooded too long and the tiger grew impatient. "I'm sure this is all fascinating, but if it's all the same, can we move along?" The preacher said, "Sure, let's get to it. You're actually right by the portal." He walked over to the 2 boulders and knelt by the opening. He pointed and said, "Right through here." The tiger said, "You first." The preacher nodded and turned into the opening. It was dark, but a faint light could be seen towards the back. A coolness swept over him, and there was a loud pop. Suddenly bright sunshine filled the space in front of him. He crawled through it and stood in a green forest. The air was much cooler here. He turned to see the tiger emerge from the opening. It was set between 2 identical boulders to the ones they had just crawled through. The preacher couldn't tell, but they could be the same boulders in both places. The tiger said, "Free at last." He looked around. "What is this place?" The preacher said, "This is the Uhari National Forest." The tiger said, "I see. This will do." He started to walk away. The preacher said, "Wait, that's it? You're just going to leave?" The tiger turned and looked at him. "Do you need something else from me?" "Well, no, it's just, where will you go? What will you do now?" The tiger turned and started to walk into the woods. "That's my business." The preacher said, "Okay, but you're not going to eat a bunch of people or anything, are you?" The tiger stopped and turned to look at him. He had a disgusted look on his face. "That's revolting. Do you have any idea what you people taste like? I'd rather eat my own excrement." The preacher apologized. "Sorry, no offense. You're the first tiger I've ever met. What I was asking is, you're not going to kill a bunch of people." The tiger regarded him with those intelligent orange eyes. "You're some kind of a preacher or something, aren't you?" The preacher nodded and said, "Something like that." "I thought so. I could smell his scent all over you." "Whose scent?" "The Creator's, of course." Surprised, the preacher asked, "You believe in the Creator?" "Of course I do. I'm no fool. And as for killing a bunch of people, as you put it, I'll just say I will not harm anyone who doesn't try to harm me. How's that?" The preacher nodded and said, "Fair enough." The tiger turned and started to walk away. Without turning, he said, "Good luck to you, preacher." "Thank you. Same to you." He watched the tiger disappear into the underbrush and was about to turn when something else occurred to him. He shouted, "Wait! What is your name?" There was a moment of silence. Then the tiger's voice said, "My name is Kovac." The preacher watched the woods where the tiger disappeared for a while before gathering his bearings and starting out himself. He came back to look for the one called Reaper. All he knew about him was whispers of dread from the disciples of the goat he interrogated. They didn't have much information, just that he wasn't human, that he appeared out of nowhere and hunted the disciples relentlessly. Many of them were afraid to travel through the wildwood because that's where he hunts. The wildwood was a large portion of old-growth forest in the Ohari. There were many old homesteads still there. That's where he would start his search. It wasn't much to go on, but it was something. The preacher unfolded a map of the national forest, marked his position in relation to the wildwood, and then shot an azimuth with his compass. He packed the map away and started out. He said, "Give me guidance. Lead the way to the Reaper."